New clues into the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Al Jazeera has obtained video showing the Saudi hit team carrying bags suspected of containing Khashoggi's remains into the Saudi consul's residence. But how significant is this, and what will Turkey do next? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. It was a murder that caused shock around the world. Just moments after Jamal Khashoggi walked into the Saudi Consulate in Istanbul on the 2nd of October, he was ambushed and murdered. His body was never found. Al Jazeera has obtained video that shows members of the Saudi hit team carrying bags that are suspected to have his body inside. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Paul Chadurgian.
It's been 3 months since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and his body still hasn't been found. But this video could throw more light on the sequence of events after he was killed. The pictures appear to show members of the Saudi hit team carrying bags thought to contain his remains into the Saudi Consul General's residence.
You can't believe these things happen in embassies or consul generals' buildings, but of course they are controllable. They're controllable in that they are Saudi property, Saudi land. The local police can't really do very much about it, and of course they wouldn't have imagined for 1 minute that the Turks were actually listening to what was going on inside.
The Saudi journalist entered the consulate hoping to pick up documents that would allow him to start a new life with his fiancée. He never came out alive. Saudi Arabia blamed his death on rogue agents. But Turkey's president says it was a premeditated murder orchestrated by Riyadh. These pictures only add another layer of complexity to the investigation.
Now we have direct evidence showing members of the killing team unloading body bags or black bags of some sort. So it leaves the impression that Jamal Khashoggi's body ended up at the consular's residence. And that's where the investigation should focus now. What happened to it there?
A few weeks after Khashoggi's disappearance, a team of Turkish investigators found traces of acid during a search of the Saudi consul's residence. The office of Turkey's Attorney General has told Al Jazeera that chemicals were used to dispose of Khashoggi's body. And now a new book is revealing more details of the killing. Diplomatic Atrocity, The Dark Secrets of the Khashoggi Murder, was written by 3 reporters from Turkey's daily Sabah newspaper. It names 2 previously unidentified members of the Saudi hit squad, as well as their links to the royal family. Also, audio recordings which allegedly prove that the crime was premeditated, and information on Khashoggi's reported refusal to text message his son in Riyadh and tell him not to worry if he didn't hear from him for a while. As a fuller picture of the killing emerges, pressure continues to grow on Saudi Arabia. Last week, the king reshuffled his cabinet, hoping to deflect international criticism.
The Saudi side would hope that this recent cabinet reshuffle puts an end to this case and relieves Saudi Arabia from this pressure by the Turks and the international community looking for some answers.
The new details are also likely to add to growing calls that Saudi Arabia names and indicts those behind Jamal Khashoggi's killing. Paul Chadurgian, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's bring in our panel now. And joining us from Istanbul via Skype, Seyma Gurbuz, politics editor at the daily Sabah newspaper. In Belgrade, Toby Cadman, international human rights lawyer and co-founder of Guernica 37 International Justice Chambers. And also via Skype from Taunton in the UK, Bob Ayers, former intelligence officer and international security analyst. A very warm welcome to all of you to the programme. Seyma, let's start with these rather chilling pictures, these black bags being carried into the residence of the consul general. Are these the biggest clue yet as to what happened to Jamal Khashoggi's body?
Well, these bags were also mentioned in the book as well, that you have mentioned the diplomatic atrocity. These bags show us that Khashoggi was actually dismembered and was carried from the consul building to the consul general's house, the building that sides with it. However, we don't know where it went from that, what happened to the body afterwards. So we are not sure what happened exactly to the Khashoggi, but we know that he was dismembered and carried from one building to the other. And yes, until now, this might be the biggest proof that shows us some clues about what happened to Khashoggi at the consulate building in Istanbul.
So, Bob, clearly they almost throw up as many questions as perhaps they answer these pictures. Could they change the course of Turkey's investigation? Should the team now, the prosecutor's office now go and get a search warrant to search the residence again?
Well, there's no way that they're going to be able to search Saudi embassy property without the consent of the Saudis. So they can get a search warrant, but they still can't search unless the Saudis consent. The embassy and its grounds are sovereign territory. It belongs to Saudi Arabia, not to Turkey.
So, Toby, if we look at it then from a legal angle, is there any way to circumvent that? Or, as Bob says, is the Saudi Consul General's residence now off limits for the Turkish investigation?
Well, certainly, and the comment that was made is quite right. It is covered by diplomatic immunity. Of course, there are different levels of diplomatic immunity depending upon the mission in question. Obviously, for the Consulate General's residence and the consulate mission, it has a different level of diplomatic immunity to what an embassy does, and it's covered by different international legislation. But it's quite right that if the Saudis don't want to play ball, if they don't want to cooperate, it's going to make it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for the Turkish authorities to get a warrant, a search warrant, and enter those premises. The other issue that we have is this is a matter that took place some time ago. It is highly unlikely that any search of those premises would yield any positive results at this stage. But what we do have are a number of identified individuals carrying black bags out of the consulate, taking them to the Consul General's premises, where we've already heard that chemicals such as acid have already previously been identified. And if those individuals are connected directly to Mohammed bin Salman, as we believe they are, then of course that does change the picture, although it effectively clarifies information that we already have, that he was murdered, that this was not a rogue operation, and it is highly likely that it reaches the highest elements of the Saudi royal family.
OK, we'll look a little bit more about an international investigation later in this discussion and the role that these sort of pictures could play in that. Seyma, I'm just interested to get an idea as to why Turkey has released these particular pictures now. It's a continuation, isn't it, of this drip leaking of information that we've been seeing in the past 3 months?
Well, actually, these informations, as I said earlier, was also included in the book as well. And Turkey is conducting its investigation, but also trying to give chance to Saudi Arabia to reveal itself. However, so far, we haven't seen any cooperation attempts from the Saudi Arabia. So Turkey is releasing its information leak by leak and trying to show that the case is still continuing despite the time despite it has been quite a time since the murder has been committed. So it's not an attempt to, sack the investigation, but on the contrary, they are trying to show that the investigation still continues and Turkey has information and there is still chance to reveal what happened and enlighten the crime itself.
Bob, at this stage, when we've seen how Saudi has reacted so far to all the revelations that we've seen, it's not really working, is it? This continuous release of bits of information here and there. It's not making the Saudis come forward and say, OK, yes, we'll reveal everything to you.
No, it hasn't, and it won't. There's no reason in the world why the Saudis would want to reveal everything. We're having a bit of a maybe a semantical issue. The Saudis are claiming it's a rogue operation, and people are listening to that, saying, "Well, maybe MBS wasn't behind it." Well, I guess one could define a rogue operation as anything that took place without the blessing of the king. Now, one thing that we haven't done yet, or I have not seen done yet, to dispute this rogue allegation would be a complete and detailed timeline of events, starting with when they first knew Khashoggi was going to the embassy, when the murder team was put on alert, when they flew into Turkey, when they flew back. I think if we put the timing together in a sequence where all of the events took place relative to each other, it would be extremely clear this was not a rogue operation. It was planned and it was executed with central control. And that's not the definition of a rogue operation.
OK. And Toby, do you agree with that? Do you think if everything is laid out in a chronological fashion, then it would be a much clearer link from the murder to the Saudi Crown Prince?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what's needed is a complete timeline of events. I think it's a very sensible approach to looking in terms of determining who is responsible and how far this goes. Clearly, if you are to look back and you are able to establish a chain of events, whether it leads directly to Mohammed bin Salman or some other person, senior official within the Saudi authorities, it will establish responsibility. I think it's also just to comment briefly on the previous point was, whether this release of information by the Turkish authorities is helpful and whether it's going to change anything. I don't think it's helpful, and I don't think it will change anything. I completely agree with both the speakers that it's not compelling the Saudi authorities to do anything, and they're not going to. It's not in their interest to cooperate, and it's not in their interest to disclose any information. So we have to have a very clear chain of events so that we can actually determine responsibility. But then that's all leading towards, which I'm sure is going to be one of the next points, where do we go from there? Where do we take it? What court of law is actually going to hear this, and whether this is ever going to be in front of a court of law? That's, of course, a bigger question.
Absolutely. And as you say, we will get to that in just a moment. I just want to, first of all, touch on what we're seeing in this new book, Diplomatic Atrocity, because there is some new audio, isn't there, that's been revealed from the book. And how far, Seyma, does that go to establishing this timeline? Because we're hearing audio from before Khashoggi actually entered the consulate.
Well, actually, the book shows that there are hours of recordings, audio recordings of the events. So previously, we were thinking that there's only a 7-minute long of the audio recording of Khashoggi's killing. But now we see that there is a previous part of that. So in this part, we see that it proves the murder was pre-planned. It was already determined, because we see some of the members of the hit squad talking about convincing Khashoggi to return to Riyadh. But if they fail, they'll commit the murder. They speak these words from their mouth. We can hear them talking. Well, at least the book shows us this part. And also, we see that in these recordings, we can hear the chainsaw's voice that dismember Khashoggi, and we see the members were talking about the murder itself while they are committing the murder. So all things was recorded and provided us information about how things happened. And lastly, they tell Khashoggi to write to his son about that he is safe, and he can't hear from him for a while, that he shouldn't be worried about him. And Khashoggi refuses to do that. So after that, the members of the squad are trying to strangle him. We can all hear that from the recordings.
So details, crucial details, very interesting in building up a picture. But as we've established, there's still no smoking gun. One thing that I also wanted to pick up on, I found it quite interesting that the book says that a call by one of the key suspects, Mutreb, saying, tell the boss the deed is done. This was something that was extensively reported. The book says it never actually took place. And Toby, I'm just wondering how crucial a piece of evidence that was in providing the link between the murderer and the Saudi Crown Prince.
Yeah, and that's something which has been discussed in the past. Is that, you know, the deed is done, and tell the boss the deed is done. Now, all of these recordings are of course important for establishing what actually took place, and of course they will have to be authenticated in order to be used, because what we're talking about is, yes, they're important for these purposes in understanding what took place, but to what extent are they going to be admissible, usable in a court of law to actually hold individuals accountable for the murder? It's going to be difficult to authenticate that and to establish who that message was directed to. We can, of course, assume, but as you know, a court of law does not make assumptions. It has to be based on evidence which is reliable. So I think that, you know, we're still some far away from establishing that. But obviously it is incredibly important in establishing how these matters took place, and the fact that this was premeditated. You know, tell the boss the deed is done is fairly clear as to they were acting under instructions.
Bob, let's look at the potential for international investigation, whether it would take place, what indeed it would achieve. The Turks are still calling for the UN to launch some sort of impartial international investigation. Do you think that is worth doing at this stage?
I see very little purpose in an international investigation. First of all, it seems as if the sole source of evidence as to the murder is coming out of Turkish intelligence sources. These recordings of what took place in the embassy are coming from Turkish intelligence. And I would note, by the way, that they didn't have the recording devices or the listening devices turned on only when Khashoggi went into the embassy. They've obviously been there before, and they've continued being there after, unless the Saudis have found them and disabled them. But the question is, if you have an international investigation, wonderful. And the international investigation concludes, as I think the entire world has already concluded, there was an organized Saudi hit team that went in and murdered this man and then went back to Saudi Arabia. The international investigation just claims that to be true. So what? Is it ever going to go in a court of law? I heard Toby say, would it be admissible? Would it not be admissible? A more fundamental question is, will it ever go into a court of law? The Saudis aren't going to turn these people over to a court of law to be tried. And under most civil justice systems, if you partake in a murder, you're an accomplice to murder, you are also guilty of murder. So the hit team's guilty of murder. Is the ambassador also guilty of murder because he condoned this activity? Or the people that dispatched them from Saudi with the intent of going into Istanbul and killing a man, are they guilty of being an accomplice to murder? Where do you draw the line? At some point in time, there's going to be so many Saudis potentially involved in this that it would be impossible to consider the Saudi government turning them over for trial.
Seyma,
So
to what
I don't
extent?
think we're going to see a trial.
Okay, yeah. To what extent do you agree with that? Because again, I mean, another thing that we took from the book, that one of the key suspects, the toxicologist Salah al-Tubaigi, he's reportedly living a free man with his family in a villa in Jeddah, and he's one of the key suspects that Saudi said was going to face trial, and that really doesn't seem to be the case.
Well, the book says that Tobaigi was thought to be not at the limelight. So I'm not sure if he's a free man, but I'm sure, according to the book, that he's not detained as we understand. So, yeah, as I said before, Saudis are not cooperating on finding the responsibles from these murders. So, from my point of view, an international investigation is definitely necessary, and as Turkey have mentioned many times before, it's having negotiations with UN on the matter, because there are still two main questions that Turkey is asking. First of all, where is Khashoggi's body? We still don't know that. Although we have some footage on carrying black bags of the murderers, we don't know what happened to those bags since the Turkish research team couldn't find any traces of that in the building. The second question is, who ordered the murder? We still don't have a clear explanation on that matter too, although many clues are pointing at the crown prince. We don't have any proof over that, since the book also falsified the common knowledge of, the deed is done quotation of the murderers.
Seyma, do you think, does Turkey really believe that we're ever going to get a conclusive answer to either of those questions?
Well, there is no harm in hoping. So there is nothing else we can do right now. We have to do whatever it takes to reveal this crime. It's our responsibility as an international community, and Turkey will do whatever it takes to establish that.
Toby, how careful does Turkey need to be? Bob touched on this earlier about it spying on the Saudi consulate, listening in. I mean, the book brushes aside these concerns by saying it was not deliberately listening. I mean, does that wash in an international court of law?
Well, that's a very difficult position for Turkey to find themselves in, that they're having to admit that they were listening in on a foreign mission. And there may be questions asked at a later stage as to whether they are listening in on other missions. The information that has come out previously was that the Turkish intelligence prefers directional listening devices rather than actually placing bugs in consulate and diplomatic missions. So it's likely that that was the method that they were using. It strikes me as very difficult to believe that they were inadvertently listening to what was actually happening, and that this would seem to be something that they have been doing. That aside, you also have to look at the question of how that can now be used. But I think the question could be asked of Turkey as to whether they are listening in on all international missions within their borders. That is a question that may well be asked at a later stage.
In the meantime, Bob, do you think we're ever going to get true justice for Khashoggi's murder?
Short answer is no. Let's examine what we would need to get more answers to his murder. Some intelligence organization, whether it's the Turks, the British, the French, the Germans, the American NSA, would have to have more information that they had gathered that hasn't been released yet. And that would provide a little bit more information. But ultimately, this crime is going to be solved through interrogation of the people that were participating in the crime, which means sitting down and interrogating Saudi nationals. And the Saudi government is never going to allow all of these people that were involved in this murder to be interrogated by foreign law enforcement people. It's just not going to happen. So the answers we have now, unless there's more information forthcoming from the intelligence community, I think is all we're ever going to see.
OK. Seyma, is there more information that's not yet been released? I've had guests on Inside Story before absolutely adamant that there is a smoking gun that Turkey's still withholding.
Well, there's no way of knowing that from my point of view, actually. But I'm sure that if there is more evidence, it will be revealed in a short period of time. We'll see that all together.
OK. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining this discussion to continue the revelations, looking at the revelations into the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Many thanks to all our guests, Seyma, Nazli, Gurbuz, Toby Cadman and Bob Ayers. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here. Bye for now and Happy New Year.